of natural selection. So you guys read about this last night, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the actual different types, so we can get on and talk about some other stuff. Okay, so the first one is called the stabilizing selection. And in a stabilizing selection, the intermediate phenotype is going to be the best phenotype. Okay, so selection that favors the intermediate phenotype. All right. So an example of this, and this is probably, and not probably, but this is definitely the most common type of selection, one that's going to favor some intermediate, and it's going to say, okay, this intermediate is good, you know, almost ubiquitously, and so most of the population will have something around the middle, right? And generation after generation, you tend to see this. So and a good example of this would be human BMI, which is body mass index. Okay, so the human body mass index, the average body mass index is 22. The way that you find body mass index is you take your height and then you divide it by your weight, and you like do some fancy calculation with it after that. But it's mostly just the ratio of your height to your weight. Okay, and I also think your age is involved in that, some other stuff. Okay. So this is, if this is the percent of the population, we can expect that the greatest number of people will have body mass indexes that are around 22. Okay, something like that. I know that bell curve looks like it's a little bit shifted to the right, but that's just because I can't draw. So if I could draw a perfect bell curve, that would look like a perfect bell curve. Okay, that's not to say that some people wouldn't select for body mass indexes that were lower than 22. That's not to say that some people wouldn't select for body mass indexes that are above 22. But on average, the intermediate phenotype of body mass index of 22 is going to be not only the most fit because of sexual selection, but also the most fit for health reasons. If you have higher than 22, you have problems with heart disease. If you have lower than 22, you have problems with malnutrition. Right? All right. So, directional selection. And that is a selection where the intermediate is still favored, right? So we're talking about something that was previously stable. Previously stable population. Shifts the mean towards one of the extremes. Okay, so again, here's our graph. This is like human height. Let's say males. Let's say the average height for males in 1950 was, say, 5'5". And then in let's say the year 2000, it was 5'7". Okay, so we would see a bell curve here. Centered around 5'5". Let's say this is for the year 1950. Okay, and then in the year 2000, you have a shift so that now the mean is at 5'7" or something like that. Okay, I don't actually know if those are the correct means, but they're close enough. Yeah.
Why would natural selection have made males taller?
It probably didn't. It was probably sexual selection. There's also a pretty good hypothesis that the genes actually didn't change at all and only nutrition changed because we are a lot more knowledgeable now about like macronutrients and micronutrients and things like that. So we know that like you need certain vitamins to live and there's birth defects and stuff like that. So there's a fair amount of evidence that says like maybe it doesn't have anything to do with genes and it's just food. But there is a fair amount of consideration to be made that like it's better to be like, let's say if we were talking about 1 foot above or below, right? For a male, it's better to be 6'7" than it is to be 4'7", right? 6'7" male, you see him, you're like, oh, I bet he's an athlete, or bet he plays basketball, or whatever, right? 4'7", you're like, wow, he's very short, right? So in that case, if we're talking about above or below the mean, it's still better to be above the mean than it is to be below the mean. If that above the mean has a higher chance to pass on the genes to the next generation, then you'll see the mean start to shift up. Okay, but that's not to say that it's somebody who's 6'7" is more biologically fit than somebody who's 5'7". 5'7" would probably still be better, normal, right? All right. Then you've got disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is where the extremes, either one of the extremes, are favored over the intermediate. Okay, so let's talk about this one for a second. Let's do an example here. We've got, let's say we got fish. Okay, so I'm gonna have one fish here that's brown. Brown fish. And my brown fish, let's say, lives in a lake that has a brown bottom. There's a lot of leaf litter or whatever, and so there's a really good amount of camouflage here for the brown fish. It's unlikely that a predator would be able to see them against the backdrop of the brown bottom. Okay, so we would say that this brown fish has camouflage. Okay, then we've got another fish. Let's say this other fish is bright yellow. Okay, due to some mutation. This is the same species of fish, just has a mutation now that makes it bright yellow instead of brown. Okay? This fish does not blend in, right? It's likely to stand out. But there is this thing in nature called aposematic coloration that essentially just means that it's like a warning, right? It says like, hey, don't eat me because I probably taste bad, or maybe I'm poisonous, or something like that, right? And so this one has warning coloration, and therefore doesn't get eaten. But let's say if we know the genotypes of these. Let's say the brown fish are big C for their genotypes, and let's say the yellowfish are little c for their genotype. Okay, so if a brown fish mates with a yellowfish, what is the genotype going to be? It's going to be heterozygous, big C, little c, right? And let's say this is a situation where there's incomplete dominance, and incomplete dominance causes it to be like brownish yellow. Yeah. So orangish. Okay? So, this orange fish is not dark enough to have camouflage, right? But it's not yellow enough to have warning coloration. And so predators are not afraid to eat it, and it's very easy to find, or relatively easy to find, and therefore that fish is probably going to get eaten, right? So this is the least biologically fit. Okay, so if you were going to do a graph, a population graph for fish color here, and we had brown here, we had orange in the middle, and we had yellow out here. What you'd be likely to see, and this is percent of the population, what you'd be likely to see is sort of an inverted bell curve like this, where the more yellow you are, the more likely you are to survive, and the more brown you are, the more likely to survive. But the closer you are to the intermediate phenotype, the less likely you are to survive, and therefore the less percentage of the population, right? So, also, this is going to cause something called assortative mating. Okay, and assortative mating means that organisms will tend to mate with a partner that has the same phenotype as them. Okay, organisms will select mates with their same phenotype. Okay, so that means that brown fish will mate with brown fish and yellow fish will mate with yellow fish. If let's say there's a chemical mechanism behind this that makes fish more likely to mate with yellow fish and brown fish, if a brown fish had that same chemical or had the chemical that made it want to mate with yellow fish, let's say that's genetic, that happens, right? Then their offspring will be orange and their offspring will be less likely to survive, and therefore that chemical that makes the brown fish more likely to mate with the yellow fish will likely be removed from that population. If a yellowfish only mates with yellowfish because of that chemical, that will be reinforced by the fact that their offspring will be yellow and therefore will be more likely to live. Brown fish that only mate with brown fish will be again reinforced, and therefore that chemical will be more likely to go on to the next generation. It's important to note that this only works for populations that are in disruptive selection. Populations that are in stabilizing selection would not be favored by assortative mating. Assortative mating, in fact, would make those worse, because if we talk about our Yao Ming situation here for directional selection, we said it's best to be in the middle here, and if you have an organism that's very tall, and they mate with an organism that has the same phenotype, which is also very tall, they're likely to have an even taller, or at least as tall, offspring, which again is worse because they are at an extreme phenotype rather than being in the middle. Whereas if a very tall person mated with a partner who was average, then it's likely that their offspring would be less tall than the tallest of the parent. Right? All right.
So why wouldn't it be good for stabilizing?
Because in stabilizing selection, if this extreme here, somebody who was down here, only mated with other individuals that were down here, their offspring would be less. They would be closer to the extreme. Whereas if they mated with somebody who was up here, then their offspring would be in the middle.
But if they were in the middle and they mated, that's good.
That would be
right?
fine, yes.
Okay.
Okay? So, let's talk about sexual selection. Okay, so these, for the most part, the three selections that we talked about up here are natural selection, where the environment is selecting here. There's some environmental pressure that's causing them to happen. But sexual selection is not environmental. Sexual selection is selection by the actual species with the purpose of producing the most biologically fit offspring. Okay? Selection aimed at producing the most biologically fit offspring. Okay, and this term most here is performing double duty for us because you could consider this as being the most biologically fit, meaning like the greatest amount of fitness, or the most, meaning the greatest quantity of biologically fit offspring, right? They both work, all right? So let's talk first about female sexual selection. Which is by far the most important. And the reason for that is that females have to be choosy, right? They have a very limited number of offspring that they can have, right? They need to select a mate that is going to provide them with the most fit offspring. And when we mean most fit in this case, we're talking about the one who has the greatest amount of fitness, right? And so that means that females are going to select for those traits that they would like to see in their offspring, and also those traits that make their offspring more likely to live. Okay? So, in humans and all throughout the animal kingdom, we see one thing selected for by far the most by females. Anybody know what that thing is? Nope. It may be related. It is status. Okay? Now, how you obtain that status may be through aggression in some organisms, but in humans it's really not, right? In humans it can be related to a lot of things, right? Positions of power, positions that bring a lot of money are those things that become sexually selected for, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. Those things are always selected for in all populations, right? And the reason for that is that not only do you want those same characteristics in your offspring, meaning like if your male sexual partner has these characteristics, that makes it more likely for your offspring to have those characteristics, but also it makes it more likely for your male sexual partner to be able to provide for your offspring and keep your offspring alive. Okay, this has a lot to do with money and things like that in humans, but even in things like lions and stuff, where the alpha male, the pack leader, is like the one that's doing all the reproduction, right? That has the most reproductive partners. The reason for that is because he's generally the strongest, right? And he's the one that's the most able to protect the rest of the pride, right? Does that make sense? Now, there's one other thing. And first of all, there's also one ubiquitous sexually selected characteristic that's selected equally by males and females. Anybody know what that is? It's kind of strange. It's facial symmetry, right? And that is, from what we can tell, the most important thing across males and females, because it indicates good genes, right? The more symmetrical your face is, the better your genes are, I guess, right? So the other thing that's selected for specifically by females are those traits, those secondary sex characteristics that indicate high levels of testosterone. So these are like muscle mass, greater amounts of muscle mass, broader shoulders, the jawline thing, the chiseled jawline, deep voices, right? These are all things that are indicative of high testosterone, but they are not important, right? For the most part, those things that I just listed, they have no bearing on your biological fitness. The reason why they are selected here is because they are indicative of fertility. And the thing that's actually being selected for is fertility, but the other things are just linked to fertility, right? And so they're byproducts of it, and so they are things that are physical manifestations of fertility, because you can't just look at somebody and be like, oh, I bet they're fertile, right? All right. So, male sexual selection. Least important. Okay? The reason for this is that this is about males selecting females. Okay? That doesn't really have any bearing on anything. The males are playing a numbers game here. They want to have as many female partners as possible to get the most offspring, right? This is where the most biologically fit offspring comes in. So you want the greatest quantity of offspring, because if you have a great quantity of offspring, then those offspring are likely to survive to reproductive age, and at least some of them will pass on your genes then, right? So the most sexual partners is the best here. Whereas females are selecting for specific traits, males are fighting, they're competing to be able to have the most offspring. They're competing for the females, right? So they're fighting other males for females, right? And so really the only thing that is sexually selected for by males then, or the thing that males show preference for, is being able to produce the most offspring. Right? And so what characteristics would indicate that a female can produce the most offspring? Yeah.
Isn't it fat content?
Fat content, yes. We'll get to that in a second. The first one is relatively obvious when you hear it, and that is youth. Right? Youthful characteristics are by far the greatest sexual selection characteristic of males. And the reason for that is that young individuals can reproduce the most times before they can't reproduce anymore. Right? Also, they're less likely to die during childbirth. Right? And so that gives you the greatest chance of having the most offspring. The most offspring will give you the greatest chance of having fit offspring. Right? Okay. What's the okay, so when we write this, sometimes people get the wrong impression. We're not talking about like children here, right? What's the thing that prevents this from selecting for children? Because children, theoretically speaking, they are the youngest, and so they could have the longest period of time of childbearing. Yeah. They're not fertile, right? So characteristics after puberty are selected for because those are the individuals that can reproduce, right? All right, that kind of goes along with this thing. So secondary sex characteristics. Characteristics that indicate high levels estrogen. Okay? So again, all the female secondary sex characteristics, body fat distribution, wide hips, even clear skin or skin that is free from imperfections. Those are all indicative of estrogen, because the thing that causes like acne and stuff like that is testosterone. Right? And high levels of estrogen will counteract testosterone, right? And so the greater amount of estrogen you have, the clearer your skin will be, okay? Estrogen also causes you to maintain body fat content. So if you've ever like read one of those comics that talks about like how easy it is for men to lose weight versus women, they're all like, I'm gonna have to do all this, and my husband does nothing and loses weight. That's because of estrogen. Right? Estrogen causes you to maintain body fat because it's something that's linked to fertility and childbearing, right? So again, all these things that are linked to estrogen are all about fertility. And because you can't see fertility, you have to have other things to be able to spot it. They're just linked to it. Okay? The last thing that I wanted to talk about that I do have time for is called the Runaway Hypothesis. And the runaway hypothesis is something that is different from these types of selections here. And that is that it's likely that the runaway hypothesis will cause you to have less fit offspring, right? This is when traits are selected for that actually make your offspring less likely to survive. Traits are selected for that make individuals less likely to survive. Okay? Now, a good example of this is the peacock, right? So peacocks are males. They're the male of the bird called the peafowl, right? And the females are called peahens, right? And a peahen is like this little bird here. It's kind of ugly and brown, and they don't have any like plumage or anything like that for the reasons that we were talking about. Because the males, they have to impress the females to be able to reproduce, and the females, they just need to choose the best male, right? So these female peahens, they don't look special at all, but the male peacocks, they have these brilliant plumages, right? These tail feathers that are extremely, extremely colorful and large. And the more colorful they are and the larger they are, the more sexually desirable that peacock is, right? But that's a problem because as they get larger and larger and larger, it impedes the peacock's ability to fly, and it definitely impedes their ability to move on land, right? So that means that they can't escape from predators. They can't get as much food, right? But they still have these brilliant plumages, and so they get selected for. So even this less biologically fit male that maybe has, you know, a 6-foot plumage or something like that would be selected over a male that has a 3-foot plumage that's faster and can fly better and can find more food and stuff, because it's what's called the runaway hypothesis. And the runaway hypothesis says that it will continue to get selected for until it's just to the point where they can't survive. So let's say it gets to the point where there's a 10-foot plumage, right? We're talking about a 10-foot tail feathers on a bird that's maybe like 1.5 feet long, right? So that's probably going to be to the point where they can't really move anymore, and they're going to die of other things because their tail feathers are too long, okay? But why does this work? Why does it continue to get longer and longer tail feathers? Why does this this process continue to get, you know, more and more extreme? Yeah.
Is that like it makes it more likely to be selected by a mate?
Yeah. So if you are a female and you are selecting for the male that has the largest plumage, right? That means that your offspring will also have the largest plumage, will then be more likely to be selected for. It also means that the females, if you're a female that has the largest, or that selects for the largest plumage, that your offspring will also, your female offspring will also want to select for the largest plumage, and your male offspring will have the largest plumage, right? And so this kind of just is a runaway, right? It's a runaway hypothesis that it keeps getting worse and worse and worse until it gets to the breaking point where the survivability is they can't maintain a high enough level of survivability to have that trait get any larger. Make sense? All right, that's it.